The Quiet Rebellion. A novel by Shadows and Novels. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. They dragged the miller's wife to the pyre at dusk. She wasn't screaming. Not yet. Just shaking, her thin hands bound in coarse rope, shoulders bent low like she expected thunder. The crowd that gathered was silent. They weren't here to protest. They weren't here to gawk. They were here because they had no choice, because the royal decree said attendance was mandatory. I watched from the balcony of the east wing, the king's shadow looming beside me. His breath was sour with wine. His fingers tapped the stone rail.
"She sold bread to the enemy,"
he muttered.
"Traitor's blood must be cleansed."
She sold a sack of grain to a traveling merchant, I replied. No proof he was Varandi. Ronereth looked at me. His eyes were red, rimmed with sleeplessness and drink.
"They're all Varandi now, Kaldus,"
he said.
"Every rat, every crier, every peasant who doesn't bow low enough."
He turned back to the square as the torchbearer approached the kindling. The woman whimpered, still not screaming.
"I gave them walls,"
he muttered.
"I gave them food, coin, victory, and they repay me with treason."
You gave them war, I thought. You gave them graves. But I said nothing, because if I said what I thought, if I ever truly spoke my mind, my body would swing beside hers by morning. They burned her just before the rain came. Smoke curled into the gray sky, smothered soon by fat drops that hissed and turned the flames into steam. The crowd dispersed. Not one cried, not one cheered. Ronereth stood there long after she turned to ash. Then finally, he turned to me.
"Join me in the war chamber. The council meets within the hour."
I bowed low. "As you command, Your Grace." He walked inside, muttering something I couldn't hear. I stayed on the balcony, hands folded behind my back, watching the ash mingle with the rain. I had served Ronereth for 22 years. I had followed him through campaigns in the Black Hills, helped draft the Peace of Whitevale, held his shoulder when his first son died of pox. I had pledged myself to his crown, his cause, and his blood. But the man I served now wasn't the man I had sworn to follow. This king ruled through fear, through cruelty, and worse. He had begun to believe his own madness. The war chamber was unusually quiet. High-backed chairs formed a crescent around the obsidian map table. Generals and lords lined either side. General Careth of the Guard, Lady Miran of the Treasury, Lord Valtor of the Borderlands. All eyes turned as Ronereth entered, cloak still damp, boots muddy with ashes. He took his seat at the head of the table and waved a hand.
"Speak."
General Careth rose.
"The Varandi delegation arrives within the month. They bring terms."
"They bring demands,"
the king corrected.
"like dogs who piss on my walls and call it peace."
Lady Miran cleared her throat.
"Our coffers are strained, Your Grace. A prolonged siege."
"Let them starve,"
he barked.
"Let them feed on carrion and salt if they won't kneel."
Miran sank into her chair. Valtor exchanged a glance with Careth. I remained still, always still. "Your Grace," I said gently, "might I suggest that we receive the delegation cordially?" If they believe we are open to peace, they may lower their guard. Ronerith sneered. Peace? A facade of peace, I corrected, for tactical advantage. He leaned back, stroking his beard.
Very well. You'll lead the talks, Caldus. No one lies better than you.
I inclined my head. As you will. He stood.
This war ends on my terms. They either bend the knee or drown in their own blood.
Then he turned and left the room. The chamber stayed silent for several long seconds. Finally, Kareth spoke.
His eyes are gone.
He said quietly.
His mind follows.
Lady Miraean nodded.
This path leads to ruin.
And all eyes turned to me. I met their stares evenly. I said nothing, but inside, I already knew the truth. The kingdom would not survive another season under Ronerith's rule. The peace delegation would be a trap. The war would escalate. Our people would die in thousands. And so, I did what I had never done before. I went to the Vault of Names. The vault lay beneath the palace chapel, where even the king's guards rarely tread. Only 3 men in the kingdom had keys. The king, the spymaster, and me. I lit a torch and descended the narrow stone steps. Moisture clung to the walls. Dust, thick as wool, lined every shelf. Files, secrets, records of every noble, trader, general, and foreign whisperer who had ever touched the court. I opened a drawer marked Operatives, Foreign Access. My fingers paused on a name I hadn't read in 10 years. Miriel of Iska, former assassin, thought dead after the Black Coast Purge. I remembered the reports. Poisoner, seductress, shadow blade, never caught, never confirmed. I removed the parchment, closed the drawer, and extinguished the torch, because I knew then what I had to do. Not for power, not for glory, but for the prince, and for a kingdom that might still be saved, if I damned myself to do it. Chapter 2. Ashes Beneath the Crown. The prince was reading in the stables again. He sat cross-legged on a bale of hay, boots muddied, cloak discarded, a tome of Eastern philosophy resting in his lap. Horses stirred in their pens. The stable hands pretended not to notice him. I stood in the doorway a while, watching him flip a page with a frown so deep, you'd think the kingdom's burdens were already his. When he noticed me, he startled, then straightened, always too quick to rise, always too eager to impress.
Lord Caldus,
He said, brushing straw from his breeches.
I didn't hear you approach.
I imagine few do, I replied. He smiled nervously, the way a young man does when he wants the approval of someone he respects, but does not yet trust.
Shouldn't you be with father?
He asked.
The council met today, didn't it?
It did.
And?
He dismissed the grain levy proposals, executed the miller's wife. His expression darkened.
He burned her.
I said nothing. The prince, Thalion, barely 19, turned away. He kicked a bucket across the floor, scattering water and straw.
She had 3 sons,
He said.
One of them served in the Eastern Campaign. I remember his name.
You have a good memory,
I remember all of them.
he muttered.
All the names on those war rolls.
His anger burned hot, but brief. He was like that, a heart of fire, but no flint to keep the flame.
You disapprove.
He said quietly. I worry, I corrected. Worry that your father's grip has turned to a fist. He nodded slowly, and then I asked the question I had rehearsed a dozen times in my mind. never quite sure if I would say it aloud. If the time came, Thalen, if your father were to fall ill, or be taken from this world, would you be ready to lead? He looked at me then, not as a prince to a subject, but as a boy searching a man's eyes for honesty.
I don't know,
He said.
I fear I wouldn't be.
I believed him, but belief is not what the realm needed. That night I met with Mirain and Valtor in the Tower of Echoes, where the wind drowned loose tongues and candlelight could be trusted not to betray.
There's no stopping him.
Mirain whispered.
Today it was a peasant. Tomorrow it will be the Northern Lords, or us.
Valtor nodded.
The council is paralyzed. The moment anyone speaks out, heads roll, sometimes literally.
I set the parchment on the table. Mirael of Iska, a name like a whisper down a dark corridor.
She's alive.
Miriam asked, wide-eyed. She never stopped working, I said. Just turned freelance.
You mean a killer for coin?
Valtor said grimly. No, I corrected. I mean a weapon, one we point only once. Miriam hesitated.
And the prince?
He's not ready, I admitted. But he's the only one who can be placed on the throne with legitimacy. The people want to believe in him. They want something better than this.
And if he fails?
Valtor asked. Then at least we bought them a chance, I said. One chance, one breath of air before the abyss swallows everything. No one spoke for a long time. Then Mirain slid the parchment back toward me.
I'll fund it,
She said.
but I want no trail, no coin, no names.
There won't be, I said, because if there were, we'd all hang. The next days were filled with motions that could never appear calculated. I began laying the groundwork. I spoke in quiet to chambermaids, in darker corners to lesser scribes. I began compiling reports, falsified but plausible, that suggested Varandi agents had infiltrated the royal kitchens. I planted records, whispered suspicions into ears I knew would carry them downriver to the right taverns. I crafted the illusion not of conspiracy, but of opportunity. The illusion that the king's demise, if it came, would be the enemy's doing. Meanwhile, I coached the prince in matters of court. You must learn the line between mercy and weakness, I told him.
And where is that line?
Where your enemy thinks you'll never cross. Some nights, I left him in the war library with books on ancient rule and statecraft. Other nights, I left him staring at his father's stained throne. A week before the Varandi delegation was to arrive, I received the message. A thin scrap of wool sealed in beeswax slid beneath my door at the third bell of night.
We move on the 13th bell, 2 nights before the accord. Poison, clean, your seal will do.
There was no name. There never was, but I felt the tremor in my hand as I burned the note. It was happening. After 22 years of service, I was about to kill my king, for the good of the realm, for the future. For a prince I still wasn't sure could bear the weight of the crown. Chapter 3. The Sealed Chalice. They say poison is a coward's weapon, but cowards don't use it the way I did. Not out of fear, but resolve. Not to avoid conflict, but to end it. Not all blades shine. The 13th bell echoed through the citadel like a war drum. It was late, deep into the second watch. The keep was mostly asleep, except for the ever-watchful guards and a handful of restless scribes. No one paid mind to the old man walking the corridors with a satchel of ink and a sheaf of unsigned decrees. No one questioned the Chancellor. Not me. I entered the king's private study, as I had hundreds of times before. Only this time, I left the door slightly ajar. The guards would assume I was there to discuss wartime dispatches or court records. Both truths, neither relevant. On the table sat the king's evening tray, dried figs, hard cheese, and a goblet of warm myrrh wine. Always the same, always untouched until he arrived to read his letters before bed. I removed a small vial from inside my left sleeve. It was no larger than a finger joint, filled with a clear, viscous liquid known to assassins as veil root, invisible to taste, lethal in measured dose, and slow enough to mimic natural failure of the heart. I uncorked the goblet with a practiced flick and let the poison run in. The goblet didn't steam. It didn't hiss. It simply absorbed the death like it had done every night with wine. I replaced the lid, adjusted the cloth, straightened the quills on his desk, wiped my prints from the goblet's stem, just in case. Then I left the room as quietly as I came, but not before looking back once, at the chair where he always sat, hunched over maps and treatises, muttering to himself about glory. He died the next morning, slumped over the map of Varand. The servants found him. By then, the poison had done its work, twisted the heart, slowed the blood, clutched the breath. There were no screams, no thrashing, just silence. A silence I had given him. They summoned me within the hour. I found the room already in chaos. Lady Miraine stood near the hearth, pale as stone. General Careth paced. The palace physician wrung his hands, muttering about failed pulses and divine omens.
"He's gone,"
the physician whispered.
"Taken in his sleep."
Valtor arrived shortly after, breathless and wide-eyed.
Was there a sign, a wound, any cause?
The physician shook his head.
"None I could see."
I looked at the king's corpse. He looked peaceful, ironically peaceful. Thalen arrived last. He froze in the doorway, eyes wide, lips trembling. Then he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, as if death might reach out and seize him too. He touched his father's hand, still warm, and that's when I saw it, that flicker in his eyes. Not relief, not grief, fear, deep, echoing fear. The court erupted by mid-morning. News spread like a plague, first through the guards, then the staff, then the city itself. Bells tolled not in celebration, but dread. Ronereth the Iron Hand, king of Idith, slayer of the Reavers, was dead, and in his place stood a boy, a scholar, a prince, a symbol of hope for some, a symbol of weakness for many. We called a closed council session by nightfall.
The Varandi arrive in 2 days.
Careth reminded us.
If they sense instability,
They'll strike.
Miraine finished.
We must crown him immediately.
There is no time for ceremony, I said. We swear him in before dawn, quietly, officially, legally.
But is he ready?
Valtor asked. No one answered. The room turned to me. He is the blood heir, I said. He has the right, and the people need something to cling to, better uncertainty than an empty throne. Still, doubt festered behind every glance. Thalen sat silently beside me, hands clasped, lips pressed tight. He didn't speak once, but I could feel the war within him. He wasn't ready, and yet he was all we had. Later that night, I found him alone in the chapel, lit only by the flicker of prayer candles.
"I didn't want this.
He whispered.
Not like this."
No one ever does, I said. Not truly.
I'm not like him. I never will be.
You cannot be. That's why you must rule. He looked at me then, not as a boy, but as a man staring down a chasm.
I don't know.
If I can, he said. You'll learn, I said, or you'll die and take the kingdom with you. He flinched, but I nodded. We crowned him just before the 4th bell, a silent ceremony in the stone hall of kings, witnessed only by the inner council and 2 scribes. He wore no jewels, no fur, just a simple tunic and a circlet of old bronze. When he spoke the oath, his voice did not tremble, but mine did, because I knew what I had done and what was still to come. Chapter 4. The Cost of Shadows. The weight of a crown is not felt in gold. It is felt in eyes, the way they watch, the way they doubt, the way they wait for you to fail. Prince Thalen, now King Thalen, sat on his father's throne like a man seated atop a pyre, regal in bearing, silent in manner, but behind his stillness, unease. I could see it in the twitch of his thumb against the edge of his seat, in how often he looked to me before speaking, in the way he hesitated before signing anything. He bore the crown, but I bore the burden of his becoming, and already the cracks were showing. The lords were the first to circle like carrion. Lord Beres of Caldrath demanded his son be named commander of the southern garrisons. Lady Meyer of the Riverlands wanted old border treaties nullified. Even the soft-spoken Lord Ilgar hinted that, in these uncertain times, additional grain tithes might be accepted in place of troop levies for stability. They smelled weakness, not in Thalen, in the space around him, and I, his chancellor, his shadow, his maker, had to move swiftly, precisely, and with the force of conviction Thalen himself could not yet summon. I began reshuffling the royal court, quietly. I promoted those who had stood with us in the dark hours, Martin, Valtor, and 3 others loyal not to the old king, but to the realm. I sent Carith on a tour of the outer provinces, under the guise of rallying support, but in truth to remove him from court, where his growling doubts might grow louder. We needed calm. We needed a narrative, so I gave them one. Varandi agents, I said, loudly enough in the right taverns. There were signs, food tampered with, a servant missing, just before the king's heart gave out. It didn't take long. The streets began to murmur what I had carefully sown, that the king had died by foreign hand, that his son, noble and young, had inherited not just a crown, but a war. It was a dangerous lie, but less dangerous than the truth. The Varandi delegation arrived 2 days after the coronation. They came in silence as expected. No flags, no open arms. Just 5 diplomats dressed in deep obsidian robes with pale gold trim, their sigil a black sun behind a silver dagger. At their front was Envoy Cassar, a narrow-faced man with skin like old parchment and eyes like polished coal. I offer condolences, he said without bowing. Thalen returned the words. Stiffly, Cassar's gaze lingered on him, then drifted to me.
And you are?
I speak for the king in all matters of state. I said, I was chancellor to his father. I remain so now.
A rare honor.
He replied smoothly.
To serve 2 kings. Some men do not survive the first.
I did not smile, and I did not blink. Negotiations began at dusk and bled into night. The Varandi came with demands, cloaked as offers. They wanted 3 port towns along the Arden coast for shared security, a permanent embassy within our walls, a 5-year trade monopoly on northern steel. In return, they promised peace. What they truly wanted was conquest without bloodshed, rule through parchment, submission dressed as alliance. Thalen hesitated. He looked to me. I gave no counsel aloud, only a glance. But in that glance I tried to say everything he needed to hear. Not yet. Hold your line. Speak little. Let them speak too much. And he did. It worked. Barely. Cassar grew wary.
You are not what I expected,
he said to Thalen after the second day.
Nor you.
The boy replied.
You smile too much for a man dealing in threats.
The Varandi envoy tilted his head, then smiled again, this time more genuinely.
I see the old king left more than a name.
Still I knew we were losing ground. The nobles feared war. The merchants whispered of profit loss. The common folk, already strained by years of harsh rule, yearned for peace at any cost. And Thalen? He wanted to believe diplomacy could save us, but I had seen enough to know better. These men would never respect us unless they feared us, and that fear would have to be earned. One night I returned to my quarters to find Mirael waiting, the assassin, the ghost who killed kings for coin. She stood beside my hearth, arms folded, a black scarf covering most of her face. Her eyes were sharp as flint.
You moved clean,
she said.
The poison left no echo. It was elegant.
I said nothing.
You should know something,
she continued.
2 of the Varandi guards watching your prince, they're not guards, they're watchers.
I frowned. Assassins?
No,
she said.
Something worse. They're observers, trained to measure weakness, hesitation. They'll be reporting everything back to Cassar.
I poured myself a drink. What would you suggest?
Make them fear you,
she said.
Or better yet, fear him.
Thalen, the boy who still apologized to the staff when speaking sharply. I looked at the fire, then at the dagger hidden in my desk. Maybe it was time the boy wore a mask. Chapter 5. Smoke without fire. A lie, when believed, becomes a fact, and facts, when repeated, become history. If I could not make the boy a tyrant, I would make him look like one. If I could not win the war, I would convince our enemies we had already started it. 3 nights after the Varandi arrived, I ordered a controlled fire set to the northern wing of the old granary, just outside the walls. It was unused, a ruin from the war before last, overgrown, crumbling, forgotten. We ensured the blaze would be seen, not felt. No homes nearby, no risk to life. But I made sure Cassar's watchers could see the flames from their tower window. By dawn, rumors flew faster than birds. A failed arson attempt on the food stores, likely the work of Varandi infiltrators. 2 captured saboteurs were paraded briefly through the streets. Silent men dressed in foreign garb, bruised but alive. They were criminals, yes, but not Varandi, and not saboteurs. But in wartime, truth is what the people believe first. The effect was immediate. Cassar grew colder, less open. The curve of his mouth never returned after that morning.
We will investigate this outrage,
he said carefully.
But we trust the boy king understands the gravity of such allegations.
He is not a boy, I said flatly. He is King Thalen, and he does not make idle accusations.
Indeed,
Cassar replied.
But I wonder, do you?
I said nothing, because what I said didn't matter. What he feared I might do, did. Behind closed doors, the lords began to shift. Some began calling Thalen the Flameborn. They meant it mockingly at first, some boy crowned under smoke and fire. But even mockery has a way of planting seeds. Fear breeds respect, and from respect, power. Yet all of this, every lie, every shadow, came at a cost. Thalen knew something was being done in his name. He was not naive, but he never asked directly, not yet. Instead, he came to me late one evening, as I sat alone with a sealed dispatch from the northern watchtowers.
Am I becoming him?
He asked, standing in the doorway, voice hushed. I looked up from my letter. Who?
My father.
No, I said. You think too much.
That's not comforting.
It wasn't meant to be. He stepped into the room, closed the door.
They fear me now,
he said.
Even Walter, even Lady Miraine. I see it in their eyes.
They fear losing the kingdom, I said. You're just the mirror showing them how fragile it all is. He sat across from me. For the first time I noticed the wear on his shoulders. He hadn't slept properly in days.
I read your letter to Cassar,
he said.
You threatened to double garrison strength along the river if they pressed again.
It was necessary.
Do you want war?
No, I said, but I want them to think we're ready for it. He looked down at his hands, then quietly,
What would my father have done?
I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. He already knew. We held a state dinner 2 nights later, under the guise of healing tensions. Every High Lord was in attendance. So was Cassar. Thalen wore the stagskin mantle, a ceremonial cape once worn only by warrior kings in times of war. The moment he entered the hall, conversation froze. He walked straight to Cassar.
I've instructed the garrisons to rotate weekly,
he said.
Any Varandi messenger found outside the agreed perimeter will be arrested. Any emissary interfering with our grain routes will be treated as an agent of war.
Cassar did not blink.
We came for peace.
And yet you brought swords.
Your father brought blood.
Thalen leaned in slightly.
Then pray I don't bring fire.
Silence. Then with a shallow nod, Cassar stepped back. After the feast, Thalen found me again. This time in the old solar where I kept my personal archives.
I said those words,
he said.
But I didn't believe them.
You didn't need to, I replied. He did. Thalen walked to the window, looked out toward the Varandi banners beyond the walls.
When this ends,
he asked,
what will be left of me?
I rose, took the bronze circlet from his head. You, I said, will be the king who saved his kingdom. He looked down, quiet, doubtful.
But at what cost?
He whispered. I said nothing, because I couldn't promise it wouldn't cost everything. Chapter 6. The Night Crown. A king's crown is worn in daylight, but true power is worn in the dark. The day the Night Crown returned to court was the day the game changed. It arrived wrapped in black silk, nestled inside a plain oak box, carried by a mute courier whose tongue had been cut long ago. Symbolic, of course. The box bore no seal, no message, but I knew its meaning instantly. The Night Crown had not been seen in 2 generations. Forged from midnight black iron and set with onyx, it was a relic once worn only during times of impending conquest, by monarchs who ruled not merely to govern, but to dominate. It was not for ceremony. It was for warning. We see you, it said, and we are coming. Thalin stared at it for a long time, after I unwrapped it. He didn't touch it.
Where did it come from?
He asked. From the mines below Briarguard, I replied. The old armory vault. I had it retrieved in secret. He didn't ask why. He knew. It was not meant to be worn. It was meant to be seen. That night, I arranged a private audience with 3 lords whose loyalty had grown less certain. Lord Harvin of the Eastern Steppe, Lady Nael of Winmere, and old Duke Brenrick of the Mountain Passes. They came expecting entreaty, flattery, perhaps bribes. Instead, I led them into the cold council chamber, where the night crown rested on a simple iron pedestal, unlit but for torchlight, silent but for the creak of stone. Thalin stood beside it. He did not speak. I did, in the old tongue. I said, "There's no word for peace, only for the silence before conquest." Lady Nael's hands twitched. Thalin did not move, but the crown gleamed like a blade in the firelight, and that was enough. By week's end, 3 more holdfasts pledged men to the royal muster. Precaution, they claimed, in case of Varandi treachery, and though the war had not begun, it no longer needed to, because now both sides feared it would, and fear was a wall thicker than any stone. But the deeper I wove this net, the more tangled I became. Kareth returned from his tour, darker and more dangerous than when he left. He had gained favor among the frontier lords, men who missed the iron hand of Thalin's father, men who distrusted what they saw as my growing shadow behind the throne.
He's plotting,
Marel told me bluntly, leaning in the rafters of my study, her face half in shadow.
He smells weakness. He believes you want the throne.
Does he? I asked. She nodded.
And you haven't exactly convinced him otherwise.
I rose, walked to the window, watched the soldiers drilling in the yard below. Let him think what he wants, I said. As long as he thinks I'm the danger, he won't see the real one.
Which is?
I looked out, at the prince-turned-king, standing in the yard, still, quiet, watching the drills with the same hawk-eyed intensity I once had. The crown, I whispered, changes everyone. Thalin began to change. He started questioning orders. He pushed back when I suggested barring Varandi merchants from the city gates. He refused to sign a decree outlawing certain border tongues. He even removed the night crown from public display, locking it away in the royal reliquary. "I'm not a shadow king," he said. "I won't rule through terror." I said nothing at first, but inside, I felt the tremble of a foundation's cracking. He was growing, fast, sharp, and dangerous, but not in the direction I had hoped, not into a mask I could control. He was becoming himself, and that, I realized with a mix of pride and dread, might undo everything. That night, Mirael found me staring at the sealed letters I had prepared. Escape routes, bribe accounts, safe houses under false names.
Do you regret it?
She asked.
What you did to the king?
I shook my head. No, I said, but I regret that it had to be done.
And what about the boy?
I turned to her, softly. I don't know if he's strong enough. She said nothing for a while. Then, maybe strength isn't what we need anymore. The next morning word came. A Varandi envoy had been killed, his body left hanging near the eastern pass. The mark carved into his chest was unmistakable. It was not ours. It was Kareth's. The war had not started, but now it might not matter. Chapter 7. The Line. Between Monsters. To build peace, I had armed the kingdom for war, But in doing so, I had summoned something I could no longer contain. The body was found at dawn. Stripped bare, his arms twisted behind his back, a crude stag symbol carved into his chest, the symbol of our royal house, inverted and bloodied, an envoy from Varand, unarmed, under protection. It was a crime against custom, one that could only have one outcome: war. By midday, Cassar stormed into the throne hall. He did not ask for explanation. He demanded vengeance.
This was your mark!
He shouted, hurling the envoy's torn standard at Thylan's feet.
Your colors, your steel, your dishonor.
Thalan stood still, pale, but not shaken. He looked to me. He didn't need to speak. I nodded, and then he turned to Cassar.
I will find who did this,
Thalan said.
and if they wear my colors, they will hang.
Not enough.
Cassar growled.
The king's words mean little when his blade cuts from the shadows.
That was it. He had called Thalan a liar, a coward, a killer. I stepped forward, but Thalan raised a hand, and then, calm, cold, he said, "You have two choices. Return to your border and await the truth, or raise your banners and make your move now." Cassar stared, then turned and left without another word. I watched him go. We had days, at most. That night, I confronted Kareth. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch.
He was a spy.
He said plainly.
You should thank me.
He was a diplomat, I hissed. And now you've handed Varand every justification they need. He leaned forward.
The people want strength. They miss your old king. And Thalan can barely hold the court together without your puppeteering. You think I don't see it?
I drew my blade then, not to kill, but to remind him that while I schemed in shadows, I had not forgotten how to fight. You serve the crown, I said, not the memory of a tyrant. Step out of line again and I'll show you how your old king really kept order. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In council, panic reigned. The lords wanted war. The priests called it divine punishment. Thalan looked to me, eyes hollow.
I didn't ask for any of this,
he whispered when we were alone. No king does.
I'm not ready.
I know, I said, but you're all we have. And it was true. The people feared war, but they feared weakness more. And if Thalan faltered now, they'd turn to someone like Kareth, or worse. The only path forward was clear. We had to unite the lords under Thalan's banner before Varand struck. And for that, we needed a scapegoat. The plan was brutal, risky, dishonorable. We would forge evidence, letters, seals, bribes, linking Kareth to a false plot with Varandi agents. Say he meant to destabilize the court, take the throne, start a war from within. A lie, but one that felt true. Thalan hesitated.
He served my father for 15 years.
He serves no one but himself now. He looked at the forged documents, the fake seal, scorched just enough to look real.
This is wrong,
he said. Yes, I replied, but it is necessary. The trial was swift, the evidence undeniable. Kareth said nothing in his defense. Perhaps he saw how far I was willing to go. Perhaps, in some twisted way, he was relieved it would end like this. In the end, it was Thylan who gave the order. His voice shook, but only slightly.
By the crown's justice,
he said.
Let traitors fall.
Kareth's head hit the stone like a dropped helm. In the square that night, the people cheered. They believed their king had exposed a conspiracy, averted civil war, punished corruption. But in truth, It was just one more lie upon a mountain of lies. I watched Thalin from the shadows. He was becoming a king, not because he wanted to, but because the world demanded it, and I had made sure there was no other path left to him. Chapter 8. The Last Letter. A kingdom held together by lies is always one letter away from ruin. The messenger arrived just before dawn, riding hard, armor caked in frost, eyes haunted. He handed me a single letter, sealed in crimson wax, marked with the obsidian crest of the Varandi throne. The courier collapsed in the hallway from exhaustion. He had ridden through the night, and by the time I broke the seal, I knew why. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was far worse. A summons. Queen Aravel herself was coming to parley in our capital in 2 days, with 50 of her best knights and 1,000 swords camped just outside the city walls. She wanted peace, or so she claimed. But this was no olive branch. It was a knife hidden in silk. If we refused, we would appear weak. If we accepted, she would see firsthand how fragile our kingdom had become. And worse, she would see Thalin, see how young he truly was, see how alone he stood. Thalin read the letter in silence. His hands trembled as he folded it shut.
I have to meet her,
he said. You don't, I replied. I can stall. We can send envoys, blame the delay on...
No.
He looked up.
If I run from this, we lose everything we built.
He was right. But the queen would tear him apart if he walked into that hall unprepared. We had 2 days to make a king out of him, or at least the appearance of one. I called Mariel. We worked in shifts, training Thalin in the history of Varand, their customs, their laws, the way Aravel spoke, the way she blinked when she lied. We studied her letters, her treaties, her speeches. I had once spied on her for the old king. I still remembered the scent of her handwriting, lavender ink, sharp and meticulous. She'll test you. I warned Thalin. She'll speak softly, smile warmly, but her words will cut. She's not here to make peace. She's here to see how close we are to collapse. Thalin nodded.
Then we show her a wall.
You're not a wall, I said. You're a blade. Stay sharp. And yet, as the hours passed, I found myself writing a letter of my own, not to Varand, not to any lord or ally, but to Thalin, a confession, the truth of what I had done, of what I had become. A record, should I fall, or flee, or be unmasked. You were never meant to be king, I wrote, and I was never meant to shape you. But the world broke open, and I had to choose which pieces to save. I sealed it, left it under the ledger in my private chamber. If he found it, he would know everything. But not before the meeting, not before the queen. The hall was dressed in red banners, not gold. Blood over glory. Thalin wore the old king's armor, reworked, burnished, sharper at the edges. He stood taller now, spoke slower, eyes colder, but still, he was not yet her equal. Queen Aravel entered without fanfare. She wore no crown. She didn't need one. She looked around the room once, at the guards, the lords, the weapons hidden beneath cloaks. Then she smiled.
Your Majesty,
she said, bowing just enough.
I see your kingdom still breathes.
Thalin did not smile.
Stronger than ever,
he replied. She circled him like a falcon sizing up a wounded hare.
Is that why your Eastern Lord hangs his banners upside down?
He didn't flinch.
We turn them right side up when guests arrive.
A few lords chuckled. She didn't. Then her eyes drifted to me, and her smile returned.
I remember you.
she said softly.
You used to whisper behind your king's shoulder. Has your voice changed?
It's louder now, I said. He listens.
A mistake, perhaps.
Only if I lie. She laughed once, and then the games began. Chapter 9. The Mask of Kings. A king's power is not in his sword, but in how well he wears the lies he must tell. The negotiations began behind sealed doors, 6 chairs, 3 on each side, a single long table of ashwood between us. Thalen sat at the head, I to his right, Lord Commander Valric to his left. Queen Aravel brought only 2, her brother, Prince Malin, and her scribe, a woman called Thera, who watched everything without blinking. For hours they spoke of borders, of reparations, of tribute, the dance of diplomacy. But it was the unsaid things that mattered. Each word she offered was laced with hidden meaning. Each pause between Thalen's replies was a cliff edge we might fall from. And still he held his own, until she asked,
Tell me, young king, what became of your father's dogs?
Thalen stiffened, a single breath.
Dead, mostly. Some turned tame.
And the ones who didn't?
They were put down.
I saw it, the flash in her eyes. She had been probing, testing, long for weakness, and Thalen had met her teeth with his own. By nightfall, the queen requested a private audience, with me alone. Thalen agreed, though his fists were clenched tight when he did. I followed her into the smaller hall, where the fire was low and the air stank of cedar smoke. She poured us wine. Didn't drink hers.
Still loyal to dead kings?
She asked. I said nothing.
You could have taken the throne yourself.
I serve the realm.
You serve the idea of the realm. That's different.
I met her gaze. She was not mocking, not even challenging. She was simply curious.
You forged evidence,
She said.
against the old marshal. I saw the letters. The seal was one of mine, impeccably mimicked, but still mine.
The wine soured on my tongue. She leaned closer.
You're clever, dangerous, and exhausted. Join me.
The offer lingered like poison. If you mean peace, I said, you'd leave tomorrow and not return.
And if I don't?
Then you will not leave at all. She studied me, then stood, then smiled.
I suppose we'll see what sort of king your boy truly is.
Back in my chamber, I found the letter I had written to Thalen, opened. He had found it, read it, and left it in place. Nothing else. No guards, no accusations, no fire, only silence. It was worse than anything I expected. The next morning, the queen extended an ultimatum. She would offer peace, conditional on Thalen sending a royal hostage to Varand to ensure our compliance. She named Prince Arian, Thalen's youngest brother. It was a clever, vicious move. Arian was beloved by the court, a symbol of innocence. Sending him would fracture the Lord's trust. Refusing would make it seem we had something to hide. The court erupted in debate. I stayed silent. For once I had no answer, because either choice destroyed us. Later in the war room, Thalen dismissed everyone except me. He held the letter in his hands, the one I had written.
You lied.
He said, voice flat. I did.
You killed for me, framed your own, built a kingdom from blood. I did.
He turned the parchment over.
Why?
Because I believed in something better. In you. even when you weren't ready. A long pause, and then,
I still might not be.
I know. He folded the letter, slowly, deliberately.
I will not send Arian.
He said. Then we go to war. He nodded and said softly.
Then so be it.
That night we prepared. We lit beacon fires, sent ravens to the outer lords, ordered the granaries sealed, the river crossings spiked. War had not yet begun, but it would. And in the quiet between horns, as the moon cast its cold light over the towers, I stood alone on the highest wall and wondered, had I saved this kingdom, or merely traded one tyrant for another in the making? Only time would tell. Chapter 10. Ash and Crown. Some crowns are forged in fire, others in silence, ash and the weight of sacrifice. They came at dawn, not with swords, but with scrolls. Varan's heralds stood before our gates with a final offer: peace, if we bowed; war, if we stood tall. 1,000 men behind them, archers, cavalry, siege engineers. Their steel glinted like a second sunrise. Inside the great hall, the court waited for Thalin's answer. Some whispered surrender, others demanded blood. Thalin stood in the middle of it all, motionless, listening, watching, and then he spoke.
I will not kneel,
he said.
Not today, not ever.
The room hushed. He walked to the window and stared at the line of banners stretching across the distant hills.
They think me a boy,
he continued.
They think our kingdom broken, small, weak, and perhaps we are.
He turned, voice rising with every word.
But I would rather die among the ruins of my father's failures than live under their leash.
The lords, one by one, lowered their heads, and then Miriel stepped forward.
I stand with the king,
she said. Then Valric, then Lord Harvin, then the steward, then even old Lord Brain, who had opposed Thalin since his first breath. One by one, they pledged, not to the crown, to him. By dusk, the gates were closed. The queen waited outside. Inside we waited for the sky to fall. The siege did not begin with arrows. It began with fire, oil launched from catapults. Torches through the thatched outer houses. The slums burned first. We fought it back, barely. Children were carried from smoke-choked alleys. Civilians packed into the inner keep. Bodies piled along the market square. Still the gates held, and Thalin never left the walls. I watched him every day, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the guilt, the weight, but he did not break. He made hard decisions. He ordered rations cut. He sent thieves to the gallows when they hoarded bread. He even refused entry to dozens of refugees from the hills. There wasn't enough space, enough food. He was becoming what a king must be. And that terrified me, because I had seen that transformation before. I had served it, and I wondered if I had planted the same seeds once more. On the 12th day of siege, Aravel sent another letter. She offered terms again. This time, only my name was on it.
Come to my tent.
She wrote.
Alone. We end this.
I knew it was a trap, but if she wanted to speak, it meant she wasn't yet sure. She was still calculating, and if I could plant even a whisper of doubt, it might buy us more days, more chances. So I went. Her tent was palatial. Red velvet, gold trim, too warm for the snow outside. She waited, armored, sipping wine, surrounded by silence.
You made him into something,
she said without preamble. I didn't make him. I prepared him. She smirked.
That's the same thing.
I said nothing.
I should burn this city to ash,
she said.
But something about that boy frightens my lords. They think he'll last, that he'll become dangerous.
She leaned closer.
So I offer you one last choice. Kill him. Let me in, and I'll name you governor. End your wars and save your people.
It was a clever offer, but it came too late. I've already betrayed one king, I said, and I did it to save this realm. I met her gaze. I won't undo that now. She let me go. No blades, no poison, because she still wasn't sure, and uncertainty is the enemy of war. That night, a snowstorm rolled over the city, and in the morning the Varandi army was gone, vanished into the fog, a tactical withdrawal, or perhaps an acknowledgement. We never saw Aravel again. Weeks passed, the city rebuilt, trade resumed, and Thalin was crowned formally, not with thunder, but with the sound of hammers, rebuilding homes, and laughter returning to the squares. He ruled wisely, harsh when needed, generous when possible, and always, always alone in his decisions. He came to me only once, on the highest wall, where we had watched the flames years before.
I read your letter again,
He said. Did it change anything?
No,
He said.
but I think I finally understand it.
He paused,
Will I become him?
meaning his father. I don't know, I said honestly, but if you do, I'll stop you. He nodded and smiled.
Then maybe we'll survive after all.
And I left him there, a boy who had become a king, not by inheritance but by sacrifice, and the lies of a man who had once whispered behind a tyrant's throne. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you enjoyed the story as much as we enjoyed creating it. If you like the novel, please support the channel by liking and subscribing. Your support means the world to us. We look forward to seeing you again for the next adventure.